Hey, Mike here. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Dark Poutine early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime. Welcome back to Dark Poutine. I am Mike Brown here in Langley, British Columbia.
And I am Matthew here in Vancouver.
Yes, you are. You are, Matthew. And you wrote this episode, but it wasn't recently.
This one I wrote a very long time ago. We're finally doing it. I think I wrote it last year.
Yes, and I've been avoiding it ever since because it kind of makes my stomach flip a little bit.
It's a doozy, isn't it?
It definitely is, but let's get into it.
The views, information, and opinions expressed during the Dark Poutine podcast are solely those of the producer and do not necessarily represent those of Curious Cast, its affiliate, Global News, nor their parent company, Chorus Entertainment.
Dark Poutine is not for the faint of heart or squeamish. Our content is often intense, and some listeners may find it disturbing. We're not experts on the topics we present, nor are we journalists. We are ordinary Canadian schmucks chatting about crime and the dark side of history. Let's get to it. Put on your toque, grab yourself a double-double and an Nanaimo bar. It's time to scarf down some Dark Poutine.
You are responsible for obtaining and maintaining at your own cost all equipment needed to listen to Dark Poutine. Dark Poutine can be addictive. Side effects may include, but not be limited to, pausing and questioning the system, elevated heart rate, pondering humanity, odd looks from colleagues as you laugh out loud at work, family members not into true crime worrying about you. Positive side effects may include some perspectives and opinions that you disagree with, as well as some wokeness and empathy. If you don't think Dark Poutine is for you, consult your doctor immediately.
In the vast, sweeping landscapes of Alberta, a shadow loomed over countless lives for nearly half a century. Between 1928 and 1972, the Alberta government sanctioned one of the darkest and least discussed chapters in Canadian history. A eugenics program that forcibly sterilized nearly 3,000 individuals deemed unfit to reproduce. This wasn't science fiction, it was a cold, calculated policy carried out in the name of racial improvement. This is a story about power, how it was abused in the name of progress, and how ordinary Canadians were robbed of their dignity, humanity, and futures. It's a story that's hard to stomach, but impossible to ignore. This is Dark Poutine episode 424, Unnatural Selection, Alberta's Eugenics Program. Eugenics is an immoral and pseudo-scientific theory that pushes the idea of attainability of human and societal perfection through the manipulation of genetics and adherence to so-called scientific laws of inheritance. While some view it as a means to eliminate hereditary diseases, the implementation of eugenics has always resulted in social engineering and the subjugation of individuals and groups by those in power throughout history. Eugenicists, drawing upon a flawed and biased interpretation of the work of Darwin and Mendel, push the idea of racial improvement. The word eugenics was created by Sir Francis Galton, who was a cousin of Charles Darwin and one of the first to start bastardizing his work. In his book from 1883 titled Inquiries into Human Faculty and Its Development, quote, "We greatly want a brief word to express the science of improving stock, to give to the more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable than they otherwise would have had. The word eugenics would sufficiently express the idea." End quote. Galton's influential book proved to be a cornerstone in the beginning of the eugenics movement. From the very beginning of eugenics, we see that it is not, quote, for the greater good and to, quote, just get rid of genetic diseases. Even in the very first description of his new word, he talks about suitable races. Quote, "A traveler in wild countries also fills, to a certain degree, the position of a commander and has to confront native chiefs. The white traveler almost invariably holds his own in their presence. It is seldom that we hear of a white traveler meeting with a black chief whom he feels to be the better man." End quote. Gross. Along with racism, his lectures tied the idea of eugenics building the British Empire and colonialism. In a speech in 1901, quote, "To no nation is a high human breed more necessary than our own, for we plant our stock all over the world and lay the foundation of dispositions and capacities of future millions of the human race." End quote. It's important that we point out these racist and colonial beliefs and how they were integral to the formation of eugenics because, surprise, surprise, Canada's eugenics programs affected immigrant, Indigenous, and different to us people disproportionately. In 1904, a German named Alfred Putz, who is considered the, quote, father of racial hygiene, end quote, started publishing a magazine called the Journal for Racial and Social Biology. Germany, as we know, took eugenics to the most terrifying extreme. By 1920, two German men, Karl Binding and Alfred Hosch, inspired by Putz's work, published their book, Permission to Destroy Life Devoid of Value. The book became instrumental in influencing Nazi ideology, and in the book, the people whose lives were considered devoid of value were the mentally ill, people with disabilities, political dissidents, people in interracial relationships, criminals, people with communist associations, some members of the clergy, Jehovah's Witnesses, people from certain ethnic groups, and of course, closer to home for Matthew and I, gays and Jews. The Nazi extermination camps were a direct extension of eugenics and the work by Putz, Binding, and Hosch.
Yeah, and I think what's really unsettling here is if you watch the language, how quickly it stops being human.
Right.
Yeah, once people start talking about stock and strains and future millions, individual people stop being people and they start becoming inputs, I guess is a word, or breeding material or obstacles to be optimized around, right? I think that history shows us something over and over again, and that is when a society starts dividing human beings into categories of value, the list never stays small.
Right, it just keeps growing.
It always starts with people that are already pushed to the margins, the poor, the disabled, immigrants, Indigenous, gay people. Then it becomes political outsiders, and the systems always expand because the logic itself is rotten to the core, right? Because once you accept some humans are more worthy than others, cruelty stops feeling like cruelty, and it starts feeling for many like the responsible, patriotic, or scientific choice. And that's the terrifying part. Eugenics didn't arrive in jackboots first, and you're going to get into this. It arrived in lecture halls and newspapers and women's group and medical journals, like supposedly respectable people using calm voices.
It's strangely timely right now, sadly. Eugenics spread through the world with many countries citing Putz's influential work as they implemented their own eugenics and sexual sterilization acts, including here in Canada. At one point in the early eugenics movement in Canada, Clarence Campbell, a representative of the Eugenics Research Association in the U.S., spoke at the Canadian Club, a prestigious forum in Toronto. The fact that this group hosted a eugenics speaker shows how in vogue these ideas were. To put it in perspective, other speakers at the club since then have been Canadian PMs Trudeau, Harper, Chrétien, Mulroney, Carney, Campbell, world leaders like Churchill, Thatcher, Blair, and Indira Gandhi. We're not saying any of those people hold these same ideas, however, they spoke at this club. Quoting from his speech, Clarence Campbell said about eugenics in Canada, quote, "The only thing missing is political will. Only with united national attitude and action can Canada hope to seize the immeasurable good of eugenics." He said Canada should, quote, "be more like Nazi Germany, which was, quote, one of the only countries that had been intelligent enough to embark on its own aggressive program of racial betterment," end quote. He went on to say that the Nazis' embrace of eugenics was, quote, "wholly human in its intent, and it not only occasions no real human suffering, but prevents a vast amount of it," end quote. These words, shocking by today's standards, were met with applause in the audience, which included Canada's intellectual elite, scholars, politicians, and social reformers responsible for shaping policy at the time. It has to be pointed out, though, that this was in the early days of the Nazi movement, before the war, and before more was known. Among the attendees was Emily Murphy, one of Canada's famous five. In fact, all members of the famous five were outspoken supporters of eugenics. From the Toronto Sun article, The Controversial Beliefs of Canada's Famous Five Suffragettes, by Laurie Goldstein, quote, "The famous five were early advocates for the rights of women and successfully spearheaded the 1929 Persons Case, which recognized women as persons under British law. For that, they are rightly celebrated and honored across Canada as early groundbreaking feminists. But the famous five were also racists, elitists, and their support of eugenics meant they advocated the forced sterilization of thousands of people in Canada, many of them Indigenous. Murphy, the first female magistrate in Canada and the British Empire, supported the sterilization of the mentally ill and campaigned against immigration, fearing immigrants from China would get white people addicted to drugs." End quote. Even Tommy Douglas, considered by many as a national hero, the father of social medicine here in Canada, wrote his master's thesis promoting eugenics, and it was titled The Problems of the Subnormal Family. Though he later backtracked on it, we will talk about that later in this episode. Not everyone was for eugenics, but the voices against it came from a few regular Canadians versus anyone with power or influence. In a 1913 letter to the Weekly Advocate, a newspaper published in a community just south of Ottawa, a reader identified as Kit thought eugenics was all a little ridiculous, the self-indulgent musings of an overeducated elite that seemed to think they knew what was best for the lower classes. Quote, "The serious world is busy studying eugenics. It is in its reading, its lectures, its conversation. Talk for a little while with one of these progressives whose strange desire it is to schoolmaster the world, and you will find yourself in a few minutes floundering about in eugenics. Who is to judge the so-called mentally defective? Assuredly not some narrow-minded pedagogue of set ideas who has never seen beyond his own limited horizon. The eugenicist," he added, was, quote, "a poor example of what he preaches so glibly," end quote.
I like this Kit dude. The thing is, there were always people pushing back. And in history, in these big historical moments, there always have been. But often there's not many.
Yeah, sometimes not enough to make a difference, yeah.
People willing to look at all this supposedly modern scientific thinking and say, this feels wrong, this feels cruel, this feels dangerous. There's not many of them. History teaches us something comfortable about independent thought. You know, most people do not actually want to think for themselves when there's social pressure not to. it's easier to go along. It's easier to trust authority. It's easier to believe that the universities or the doctors or the politicians or the newspapers are right.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of very confusing information lately, that's for sure.
It depends on the university, Mike. Depends on the doctor. Depends on the politician, right? So everyone gets into these camps of like, some sort of leadership has told me, so I'm going to go along with it, right? Because it starts feeling patriotic.
That's such a loaded word now.
Progress and morality are not the same thing. And sometimes the only people holding on to basic human decency are this stubborn handful of voices that everyone else calls backwards or naive. And I like to think of myself as a backwards or naive person.
Oh, dear. Well, me too.
Right? If people want to call me that, go ahead.
Fair enough. At the time of Kit's writing, eugenics in Canada was still mostly a theory. It hadn't inspired a single law, and not a single Canadian had seen their reproductive organs forcibly destroyed as a result of a eugenic pronouncement. That was to change dramatically over the next 2 decades. Over the years, hundreds of newspaper items touted the imperative of imposing some form of population control over the, quote, feeble classes. The Sioux Star ran a special supplement in 1926 outlining how American progress on eugenics threatened to leave Canada behind. Quote, "The most important and powerful of all eugenic factors is the installation of eugenic idealism in the idealism of human mating," read a column by Charles Reed, former president of the American Medical Association. Eugenics often spoke of the dire need to teach eugenics within public schools so that students could be appropriately instructed on how to pick a genetically suitable mate. And so eugenics soon found its way into school curricula. Canadian sex education classes taught the next generation not just how it was done, but who should be allowed to do it. As early as 1918, the annual general meeting of Canada's Child Welfare Association was passing resolutions for a teacher of eugenics to be present in all public schools. But it was the public health establishment that would prove the loudest and most credentialed backers of eugenics. Quote, "In Canada, the most vocal defenders of eugenics were to be found in the ranks of the medical profession," reads our own Master Race, a 1990 text on the history of Canadian eugenics. The Canadian Medical Association Journal and the Canadian version of The Lancet were some of the first publications to openly advocate the right to breed should be denied to criminals, degenerates, and even epileptics. Before Alberta took the national spotlight for its eugenics program, Ontario was really the driving force for eugenics theory in Canada and where the movement gained early traction. One of the key medical professionals promoting eugenics was Dr. Helen McMurtry. McMurtry was one of the most influential women in Canadian public health in the early 20th century and one of its most troubling. A pioneer physician at the time when female doctors were rare, she held senior government roles, including Ontario's Inspector of the Feeble-Minded and later Chief of the Division of Child Welfare in Ottawa. She wrote popular guides on infant care, hygiene, and maternal health that were handed out by the thousands to new mothers across the country. Her mission on the surface was to build a healthier, stronger Canada, starting in the nursery. But health, in McMurtry's mind, was deeply tied to heredity. She was a devout believer in eugenics, the idea that society should promote reproduction among the fit and prevent it among the unfit. In her pamphlets, like The Almosts, a study of the feeble-minded in 1906, she described the feeble-minded as the menace of the future and called for their segregation and eventual sterilization. Her language was clinical, moralistic, and often dehumanizing. But Ontario never enacted a sexual sterilization act, nor did any other provinces with the exception of Alberta and British Columbia. In 1923, the Vancouver Sun published an item about a delegation of Vancouver women who were lobbying the BC government for laws to restrict marriage only to those with, quote, a clean bill of health. Quote, These Vancouver women should be granted their wish, declared the newspaper. Eugenic marriages are the only hope to providing a healthy, virile, intelligent race, end quote. Eventually, this delegation of Vancouver women and the Vancouver Sun got its way. In 1933, BC amended its Marriage Act. Under this new law, anyone deemed mentally defective couldn't marry without written approval from a provincial official, either the superintendent of neglected children or the director of a mental hospital. They didn't say who counted as defective. They didn't have to. The targets were clear. People with intellectual disabilities, psychiatric illnesses, Indigenous folks, and the poor. It was all cloaked in the language of public health and morality. Marriage, the province decided, was no longer a private or spiritual union. It was a gate the state could close permanently if it didn't like your genes. The Catholic Church stood firm against eugenics. In 1930, Pope Pius XI wrote that, quote, "Public magistrates have no direct power over the bodies of their subjects. They can never directly harm or tamper with the integrity of the body, either for reasons of eugenics or for any other reason." End quote. In 1939, Catholic Archbishop William Duke of Vancouver condemned BC's marriage law, saying it was, quote, "an unnecessary restriction on the right to marry," and urged Catholics to resist. Meanwhile, most Protestant leaders were praising eugenics as godly work. Anglican clergyman William Inge declared in 1933, quote, "The Church should actively support the eugenics movement and discourage the prejudice that exists against it." End quote. Isn't the whole thing based on some sort of prejudice? Anyway, in 1933, the BC government, under the Conservative Premier Simon Fraser Tolmie, passed its own Sexual Sterilization Act. It did resemble Alberta's legislation, but was applied much more narrowly and was reduced over time, while Alberta's was enlarged. In BC, it's estimated that a few hundred people were sterilized before it was abandoned. Most of the records have been destroyed, so it's difficult to know and impossible to tell personal stories, as we couldn't find any. That said, in the 1990s, while working with people with intellectual disabilities, I got to know an older woman for whom I'll use the pseudonym Betty. She'd been sterilized in the BC Eugenics program when she was a youth. She was unable to share her story with us, but it was well known among the other staff that she'd undergone the procedure and also lacked the ability to advocate for herself prior to it occurring. Years later, a number of elderly women successfully sued for compensation, but we couldn't find their names, as perhaps they didn't want them published. The Canadian public mostly went along with it all. Eugenics wasn't controversial. It was common sense. Newspapers, educators, and doctors backed it. Even critics often didn't argue against the idea, only about how it was being implemented. The chancellor of McMaster University said in 1934 that he opposed forced sterilization, not because it was wrong, because it wasn't being done scientifically enough. That's the tone we find again and again. Cold logic, clinical cruelty, and very little compassion mixed with fairground contests for the most eugenic baby, celebrity endorsements, and marketing. Remember the ivory babies? Yeah, there's that. Companies started slapping it onto products such as baby food like it was a stamp of scientific approval. A 1918 ad in the Montreal Gazette even claimed that an early version of the Jolly Jumper could help create a so-called eugenic baby. It sounds absurd now, but back then it was just good advertising. But then, suddenly, almost overnight, Canada, with the exception of Alberta, blinked. What triggered this sudden shift? Well, it started in 1933, when the Nazi Party took real power in Germany. At first, Canadians watched from a distance, but by 1936, disturbing reports began to trickle out. German sterilization courts, it seemed, had gone off the rails. One syndicated news report appearing in Canadian papers described people being sterilized for things as absurd as not being able to explain the difference between a brook and a pond. Quote, "The German eugenic courts use odd and sometimes unexplainable methods to determine just who should be sterilized in the Nazi race purification program," it read. By 1939, with war looming, the full horror of Nazi eugenics was becoming harder to ignore. What had started as sterilization had escalated, first to the euthanasia of disabled people, then to the mass shootings of entire communities, and ultimately to full-scale gas chambers and genocide. Suddenly, Canada's own eugenic rhetoric, talk of racial hygiene and cleansing the stock, sounded less like science and more like complicity. It was a moment of reckoning. For Tommy Douglas, it hit especially hard. We talked earlier about how Douglas had supported eugenics in his master's thesis by proposing sterilization for those labeled morally delinquent. But then in 1936, he visited Germany. What was supposed to be a tour of a modern socialist nation turned into something else entirely. He saw Nazi ideology up close, the pageantry, the control, and the hatred, and it changed him. Reflecting on that visit years later, Douglas wrote, "It was frightful." When he became Premier of Saskatchewan in 1944, he rejected the policies embraced by his fellow progressives in Alberta and BC. He never even brought up the idea of controlling reproduction in his province. For Douglas, eugenics had crossed a line, and that line had been drawn in blood. However, it was at this time, when the rest of Canada was dropping eugenics like a hot potato, that Alberta ramped it up. We'll get into the specific Alberta Eugenics Act after a short break. And we're back at the halfway point. I know it's weird and a bit meta, but what are your thoughts on what you've written so far, Matthew? I mean, I've added some things, but you know.
It's always weird when I'm like, what are my thoughts on what I've written? I think when I was writing this, the one thing that bothered me through the entire process was how ordinary it must have looked to so many people at the time. We like to imagine atrocities announcing themselves dramatically, that evil arrives wearing some sort of villain's uniform, but most of the people behind this probably thought of themselves as practical or rational or progressive or good citizens improving society, right? And honestly, that's what makes this story dangerous beyond the history itself, because eugenics wasn't built by monsters standing outside of society. It was built by supposedly respected people at the very center of it, right? And and if you look at this, I think what is absolutely fascinating is a lot of, at the time, feminists were pushing this.
Yeah, right.
And doctors and politicians and newspaper editors and people who believed intelligence gave them the right to decide which lives had more value than others.
Yeah.
And once a society accepts that premise, then you're already screwed because compassion starts getting treated like weakness.
Right.
A poor kid becomes a burden, or an Indigenous girl becomes a social problem, or a disabled person becomes a cost calculation. And human beings stop being human beings and start becoming categories to manage. And as soon as you start thinking of humans as categories to manage, it all goes downhill. Right. And you can hear it in the language through all of this story. Defective, unfit, feeble-minded. These are bureaucratic words that create emotional distance, because if you can rename people as problems instead of using their actual names, you can justify almost anything that's done to them, right?
Yeah, that's quite a scary prospect. Yep.
That's why this history matters so much now, not because we're secretly about to reopen eugenics boards tomorrow, but because the temptation underneath it never really disappears. The temptation to divide people into worthy or unworthy, or productive or unproductive, or valuable or inconvenient, is always here in society. Our technology changes, the vocabulary changes, but human arrogance is the one thing that never changes. For me, it's also a huge warning about government and institutions overreach into private lives. This is something that I loathe, right? And it's both equally, right? Like, if you're sitting more on the left or more on the right, don't sit there on your little high throne, because, all sides do this. The only way not to do it is to go, you know what? You stay out of my life. You stay out of telling me who I am or who my kid is, right? You stay out of it.
Funny how that old golden rule keeps coming back and rearing its very pretty head. Do unto others, you know? Yeah. Anyway. Alberta in the early 20th century was fertile ground for eugenics. The province faced a growing wave of Eastern European immigrants and had a substantial Indigenous population, which many in power viewed as a threat to its, quote, social fabric. Combined with a reformist political climate and an obsession with, quote, modernizing society, these fears created the perfect storm for eugenics to take hold. Canadian eugenics generally advocated for one of two policies. First was the eugenic marriage, the idea that couples should only be allowed to marry if they could procure a doctor-issued eugenics certificate following a physical examination. This was called positive eugenics. The second policy was forced sterilization. For Alberta, positive eugenics wasn't enough. There would also need to be a system of, quote, negative eugenics to ensure that those they considered unworthy could be forcibly deleted from the national gene pool. When Alberta enacted the Sexual Sterilization Act in 1928, it became the first province in Canada and indeed the entire British Empire to authorize the sterilization of individuals deemed mentally defective. And when it was passed in Alberta, it was implemented with gusto. The Act established the Alberta Eugenics Board, a 4-person panel with the authority to recommend sterilization for institutionalized individuals. Facilities like the Provincial Training School for Mental Defectives in Red Deer became key feeders for the program. The Provincial Training School, we'll call it the PTS going forward, housed individuals labeled as feeble-minded or incorrigible, often using broad and pseudo-scientific criteria. Many of those institutionalized were not there for medical reasons, but for their inability to fit societal norms. From the Alberta Law Review, historian Mikkel Dack explains, quote, the term mental defective was applied broadly, targeting not only those with legitimate mental health issues, but also individuals who are poor, Indigenous, or otherwise marginalized in Alberta society, end quote. One of the earliest cases reviewed by the Alberta Eugenics Board was that of MP, a 17-year-old Métis girl institutionalized for incorrigible behavior. It's a vague term. What does it mean? From the Journal of Historical Sociology, quote, the term incorrigible was often applied to young girls who exhibited behaviors considered inappropriate for their gender or age, such as sexual activity or disobedience, end quote. The board reviewed MP's case and approved her sterilization, claiming that her behavior made her unfit for parenthood. The official justification read, quote, MP displays no capacity for self-restraint and poses a risk of passing on her defective traits. Sterilization is necessary to protect future generations, end quote. Yuck. I can't believe I had to say those words.
Look how quickly the mask slips here.
Yeah.
So this is one of the earliest cases, right? And they're focusing on a young Métis girl whose crime essentially was not fitting in neatly to behavioral expectations of the time.
Yeah.
Incorrigible, right? Such a vague, elastic word. She was probably rebellious or sexual or defiant right out of the gate. You can already see what the system really is. It's not medicine. It's not science. It is social control. That's all this is about. This is not medicine or science. It was social control from the very beginning. And because people... You know, the people being targeted over and over again are the same people society already viewed as inconvenient or undesirable. You know, look at this. It's Indigenous girls, it's immigrants, it's poor families, it's young boys and girls who didn't behave properly. That's who was targeted.
Yeah, quote properly.
Right, quote properly. That was like from the get-go. That's who was targeted.
Like many of the patients at the PTS, MP likely had little understanding of what her surgery was for. From the Edmonton Journal in 1931. Many of the patients didn't even know what was being done to them. They thought they were going to the hospital for something else. The sterilizations were routine, hardly anyone questioned them, unquote. Public sentiment at the time largely aligned with elite advocacy for eugenics. The United Farm Women of Alberta, led by figures like Margaret Gunn, strongly pushed for the legislation, arguing that eugenics would safeguard the future of society. From Margaret Gunn's 1928 speech to the United Farm Women of Alberta, quote, "The government must ensure that our civilization is not lowered by allowing undesirable strains to propagate. Democracy was never intended for degenerates," end quote. Alberta's eugenics supporters framed sterilization as both a moral duty and a practical solution to societal problems. Media outlets echoed this sentiment. From the Edmonton Journal in 1929, quote, "This forward-thinking law spares future generations the burden of defective individuals. It is a necessary step to protect the vitality of society," end quote. While moral objections to eugenics existed, especially from the Catholic groups, they were largely drowned out by the dominant narrative. Advocacy by elites and institutions reinforced the idea that sterilization was a progressive and necessary measure. From the Medicine Hat News in 1929, "The mentally unfit must not be allowed to propagate. Sterilization is not only humane but vital for the betterment of future generations." The board's chair, Dr. John McEachern, was a staunch defender of the program. Speaking at a 1933 public lecture, he said, quote, "Sterilization is a small price to pay to protect future generations from the burdens of hereditary defects. This is not an act of cruelty, it is an act of mercy," end quote. Between 1929 and 1972, Alberta's Eugenics Board authorized 4,785 sterilizations. Over 2,800 of those were actually carried out. Nearly two-thirds of them happened without the patient's consent or even knowledge. As the years went by, the board moved from getting consent from family members to not getting consent to not even telling their victims what was being done, saying instead that they were getting, quote, "their appendix removed." One of the most harrowing aspects of Alberta's eugenics regime was its assumption of infallibility. The board members, supposedly well-regarded professionals in psychiatry, education, and law, approached their decisions with a detachment of scientists, though their approach was far from scientific. It was more based on their whims, driven by their own prejudices, and supported by very dubious, and some say often faked, IQ tests. A young girl's refusal to attend school, for example, might be interpreted as a sign of moral defectiveness. A boy's difficulty with speech might be read as congenital feeble-mindedness, but it went deeper than cognitive assessments. Being Indigenous, being in poverty, being promiscuous, having a different race or sexuality, all of these things could mark a person as unfit in the eyes of the state. Dr. Leonard J. Levan was the medical superintendent of the PTS and was one of the key people feeding the Eugenics Board its victims. He would write very short case summaries, often just a few short sentences, and present them to the board for approval. Here are a few examples. Case 1951. Problem: congenital syphilis. Mental defective. Age 3 years. Mental age 2 years 2 months. Reason for sterilization: danger of transmission to the progeny of mental deficiency. Danger that the exercise of power of procreation may involve risk of mental injury to the patient and progeny. Case 3285. Age 14, French-Ukrainian. He and his brother are illegitimate children. IQ 71. Past, cleared for vasectomy. Case 3280. Female, race origin Irish-Polish. Has shown a little improvement in her work habits. She is still young and needs considerably more training. Verbal IQ 70. Performance 64. Full-scale IQ 64. Reason for sterilization: danger of transmission to progeny of mental deficiency. Incapable of intelligent parenthood. End quote. Let's stop there with Case 3280. This case summary is that of Leilani Muir, the woman who would, almost 40 years later, successfully sue the Alberta government and shine a spotlight on what was done to her and over 2,800 others. Leilani was born in Calgary in 1944. She grew up in an abusive home. At the hands of her mother, she suffered years of physical abuse, emotional cruelty, and food deprivation. Her mother did not want her and made a calculated effort to offload her to the state. She claimed Leilani was mentally defective and told social workers she was unintelligent and had a disciplinary problem. Quote, "My mother told them I was a moron. She made me someone I wasn't so she could get rid of me," Leilani said in an interview in The Sterilization of Leilani Muir in 1996. In 1955, at the age of 11, Leilani's mother got her way. Leilani was locked up in the PTS. She spent a decade at the facility, completely abandoned, and nobody ever getting in touch or visiting her. The PTS wasn't a school, really. We would consider it a jail today. Many have told stories of emotional and physical abuse at the hands of some of the staff. It was not a happy place where kids would thrive. It's shocking to think that a kid would be locked away like this for simply being considered of low intelligence. But here's the thing. Leilani wasn't that. She was of normal intelligence. She was a, quote, normal little girl. In fact, years later, in 1996, she scored 101 on an IQ test.
This woman, I watched so many videos of her talking and read so many interviews with her. And I don't know if you do this, Mike, when you're reading about victims, but I just became so protective of her.
Yep, I totally do that.
In a lot of ways. And not that this matters, but the average IQ is considered 100. She's 101.
Right? Completely normal.
Not that it matters. If her IQ was 40, it shouldn't have mattered. But she's an average IQ woman, and this happened to her because of this horrible system.
Yeah, it's pretty gross.
What's your IQ?
Not that I think it's important. Do you really want to know?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been tested a few times, and depending on the test, it ranges between 136 and 143.
You should start applying it, dude.
Oh, dear. Oh, boy.
I've had a bunch of tests over the years. I got from 126 or something like that to like 138.
Yeah, but look how far it's gotten us. I mean, here we are, co-hosting a true crime podcast. And IQ tests are like a culturally biased thing anyway, so I don't know.
Because actually the test is like, there's cultural frameworks over it, right?
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's a rabbit hole that I don't really want to go down right now, but in the context of this show, yes, Leilani was a completely normal person, and they sterilized her at the age of 14 when she started menstruating. Erica Dick, historian and author of Facing Eugenics, in an interview with a Canadian Medical Association journal in 2007 said, quote, "Puberty was often treated as a turning point, especially for girls. If they were thought to be intellectually limited and sexually active, or even just attractive or flirtatious, that was enough to raise the alarm," end quote. It was when Leilani got her period that Dr. Leonard J. Levin referred her to the Eugenics Board with that case summary. Leilani later reflected on what occurred. Quote, "I didn't know at the time what was happening. They told me they were taking my appendix out. I never asked questions. Back then, I just did everything I was told. I didn't know anything about the sterilization because we were told they were taking our appendix out. Well, they did that, didn't they? But they also sterilized us," end quote. The children, when their numbers came up, were supposed to be interviewed by the board before approval. Leilani talked about that meeting. Quote, "The Eugenics Board had to give approval, just 5 minutes in their office, and we were out of there. It took 5 minutes for them to decide to wreck our lives. And I don't even know why they met with us, because they already had their minds made up. It was already stamped and cleared. We weren't human beings. We weren't cattle. They were literally just like on a conveyor belt throwing us through," end quote. Leilani spent the rest of her years at the PTS thinking that she had simply had her appendix removed. At the age of 21, as an adult, she was released. At 25, she got married and started trying for children, but when it didn't seem to be working, she went to a doctor. She described that appointment, quote, I went to the doctors and needless to say they found out a lot more than I anticipated by doing tests. I didn't have any tubes left to have kids. And he said my insides looked like I'd been through a slaughterhouse. Those were his exact words, end quote. Leilani and her first husband eventually divorced. When she got married the second time, she and her husband decided they wanted to adopt in 1981. Leilani loved children and made money running a daycare at her home. From Eugenics archived LAE in Western Canada project, she tells the story of sending the kids home at the end of the day and preparing for the meeting with social services for the adoption. Quote, there was a young girl who was pregnant. She knew my husband and I, and she always wanted us to have her baby. When the social worker came to our door, she said, your adoption has fallen through. I asked her why, and she said, we just went through all your files that you had given us, that you had a mark against you. You were in an institution. In the papers there, you would not be a fit mother, end quote. The social worker had a copy of the case file 3280, where she was deemed incapable of intelligent parenthood. Leilani went on to say, quote, I took everything I bought. There was about $2,000 worth of stuff I'd bought for the baby. I took it outside and put it in a burn barrel and burned it all. Smashed everything. I went into a shell and stopped talking to anybody. I stopped babysitting after that. I didn't have the heart anymore, end quote. In 1995, Leilani, after having undergone further operations and an eventual full hysterectomy due to complications from the butcher job that was done to her body at the hands of the Alberta government when she was 14, decided that she'd had enough. She sued the government for compensation, and importantly, she wanted an official apology from the government for what it did to her and 2,833 others. The case was heard by Justice Joanne B. Veit. In 1996, she ruled that the government had wrongly sterilized Leilani Muir. After hearing evidence about the history of the eugenics movement, the origins of Alberta's Sexual Sterilization Act, the operation of the Eugenics Board, and the details of Leilani's life, Madam Justice Joanne B. Veit found that, quote, the damage inflicted by the operation was catastrophic. The wrongful stigmatization of Ms. Muir as a moron has humiliated Ms. Muir every day of her life, and the circumstances of Ms. Muir's sterilization were so high-handed and so contemptuous of the statutory authority to effect sterilization, and were undertaken in an atmosphere that so little respected Mrs. Muir's human dignity that the community's and the court's sense of decency is offended. Judge Veit awarded Leilani damages of $740,780 and legal costs of $230,000. That ruling was pretty damning of the Alberta government, but they did not offer an official apology. Instead, they doubled down. In 1998, the Alberta government decided to invoke the notwithstanding clause in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in order to stop anyone else from suing. The notwithstanding clause says the provincial government can override the Charter of Rights and Freedoms if there is what they consider to be an overwhelming public good. For the government to say limiting the financial compensation for people who have been forcibly and wrongfully sterilized is justification for overriding the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is scandalous, to say the least. On the 10th of March, 1998, the Alberta government introduced Bill 26 to limit compensation for the victims of their eugenics program. However, it was withdrawn only a day later because there was an absolute firestorm of negative reaction from the public, the press, and various organizations in Alberta and across Canada. Lawyer Alan Garber, who represented about 150 of the survivors, says in Surviving Eugenics, quote, up to this point in time, the notwithstanding clause has been used very, very carefully. This use of the clause was without a precedent in Canadian history. The use of this clause by a litigant, the government of Alberta, to take away the rights of people who were suing them, of people who had already been abused once in their lives, and then to have them abused again by taking away their rights to sue. I was astounded, end quote. Because of Leilani's bravery, tenacity, and yes, intelligence, she paved the way for other survivors to come forward. Her story forced Alberta and Canada to confront its eugenic past. In the wake of Leilani's victory, hundreds of sterilization survivors emerged from the shadows. Many had never spoken of what had happened to them, too ashamed, too traumatized, or too convinced that no one would care. There were also those, like the one I mentioned, who were unable to speak for themselves. Survivor support groups formed, pushing for acknowledgement and reparations. In 1998, Alberta set aside $142 million to compensate more than 800 sterilization survivors. If you work that out, it's not a lot of money for everybody, especially with what was done to them. Sadly, Leilani died in 2016, never having got the official apology from the Alberta government. In 1999, Premier Ralph Klein, in an interview with the Globe and Mail when asked about the apology, said, quote, "I don't know that there's a lot of value in saying sorry." End quote. A review of Alberta Legislative Assembly records show no motion, resolution, or statement of apology regarding the eugenics program or its victims.
Yeah, and I think this reveals something deeper about institutional behavior.
Yeah.
Governments will pay damages once courts force them to, when they're forced to acknowledge liability. But an apology is different. An apology is moral recognition. It means admitting not just that there was harm that occurred and you're going to pay for liability, but that the values behind the harm were wrong. Intentionally not issuing an apology says that there hasn't been an acceptance that the values behind the harm was wrong.
That's exactly how I felt about it, too.
This is one of Alberta's great shames.
Yeah. Well, you might think all this is behind us, that we've learned our lesson, but the echoes of eugenics still ring out. Today, with the advent of gene editing technologies like CRISPR, new ethical dilemmas are surfacing. In China, scientists made headlines after altering embryos to create genetically superior babies. Around the world, debates rage over designer children, raising questions eerily similar to those of a century ago. Is it still eugenics if people choose it for themselves? What if it's to eliminate disease? Where do we draw the line? And just like 100 years ago, the loudest voices in these debates are not those of the marginalized, but of scientists, politicians, and Silicon Valley billionaires. And that's it for Dark Poutine episode 424, Unnatural Selection, the Alberta Eugenics Act.
That's right, it's time for voicemails. You can leave us a message at 1-877-327-5786 or 1-877-DARK-PTN. We'd love to hear from you. Let's see who called us this week.
Alrighty, here's our first and only voicemail.
Hello, my name is Callie Jo, and I live in Kentucky, and I love your show. I've been listening to y'all for a really long time. I have no connections to Canada whatsoever, and I normally don't particularly like podcasts hosted by men, but I think y'all are a couple of real gems, and I love you, and I just wanted to call and let you know, and I'm going to try and think of the Appalachian equivalent to go shit in your hat, because I don't think that is something that we say here, so I think the best equivalent would be go smoke a cat turd in hell. So, love you guys. Go smoke a cat turd in hell. And I look forward to listening to more episodes. Bye.
Well, thank you, Kelly Jo from Kentucky. Oh, dear. Yeah, go smoke a cat turd in hell. That's a new one.
That's hilarious. I love it.
So what do you think Kelly Jo does there in Kentucky, Matthew?
You know, I'm going to have her as a cattle rancher.
A Kentucky cattle rancher named Kelly Jo.
Yeah. Yeah, but she's sort of like some of these, like these heroic cattle ranchers you see in TV shows and movies sometimes. Like the really cool ones. They have the homestead and I picture this like massive log house and she gets on horseback and checks out the cattle and stuff. Yeah, and avoids the aliens that are on her land.
Okay.
What was that show? Where there's like aliens in a hole on the ranch?
Are you talking about Skinwalker Ranch?
Maybe. Anyway, Kelly Jo, cattle ranches, and dodges the skinwalkers.
There you go. I don't know if any of those things happen in Kentucky, but oh well.
And Kelly Jo now has a connection to Canada. She knows us.
Yep, she just made 2 new Canadian friends. Thank you.
Thank you for the call.
That's it for this week's voicemails. Again, you can leave us one at 1-877-327-5786 or 1-877-DARK-PTN. We'd love to hear from you, even if it is just to say hi and to tell us to go shit in our hats. If you're stumped for what to chat with us about, a quick story is welcome. So we do have a donut money donor this week, and that person's name is Amber Brownlee. Thank you, Amber.
Amber Brownlee, thank you for the donut money.
Thank you, Amber, for the Interact donation. And if you're Canadian, you can send us cash that way through our email. Yeah.
You know what Amber does? Amber plays the sarrusophone in a jazz band.
What the heck is a sarrusophone?
I'm glad you asked, Mike. It's a very rare family of metal double reed woodwind instruments patented in 1856. So they have 2 reeds.
I immediately thought of Lou Reed, but anyway. So where on our fine planet, Matthew, does Amber live?
She lives in Florida.
Okay.
Near, where's is the Salvador Dali Museum?
There's a Salvador Dali Museum in Florida?
Yeah, she lives in that town where the Dali Museum is.
Okay, Google tells me it's St. Petersburg, and I was there when I was a little kid, like 10 years old, but I did not visit the Salvador Dali Museum at the time.
Oh, well, there you go. No.
I was more interested in Busch Gardens for the safari and having the wits scared out of me at the Haunted Mansion in Disney World. So, anyway, I wish I could go back and see Salvador Dali. Thanks to all our patrons and Donut Money donors, past and present, for your generosity. It helps to keep the show going. You can become a patron of Dark Poutine at patreon.com/darkpoutine. For a one-time donation, you can send us donut money via PayPal or Interact using our email address, darkpoutinepodcast@gmail.com. If you don't already subscribe to the show, it would mean a lot if you did. You can easily find Dark Poutine on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. If you haven't gotten yours yet, my 2 books are available to order via links on the Dark Poutine website or anywhere fine books are sold. And speaking of darkpoutine.com, check it out for show notes and other cool stuff. We'd appreciate it if you gave Dark Poutine a like or a follow on Facebook and Instagram. Most importantly, thank you for listening. Tell your friends about us. Word of mouth is a powerful thing. And that is it for this episode of Dark Poutine. We love you folks very, very much. So until next time, don't forget to be a good egg and not a bad apple. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, y'all.